Have you ever wondered why one of the most brutal and chaotic books in the Bible was included in God's holy word? The book of Judges contains stories so violent and disturbing that they make modern horror movies look tame. We're talking about mass murder, civil war, human sacrifice, and moral corruption that would shock even today's audiences. Yet this book sits right in the middle of Scripture, demanding our attention and understanding. Today we're diving deep into the book of Judges, a fascinating and complex text that reveals the darkest period in ancient Israel's history. This isn't your Sunday school version of Bible stories. This is raw, unfiltered human nature colliding with divine purpose in ways that will challenge everything you think you know about faith, leadership, and society. The book of Judges picks up where Joshua left off, after the Israelites had conquered the Promised Land. But here's where things get interesting. Instead of a unified nation under strong leadership, we find a collection of tribes struggling to maintain their identity and faith. The central theme that runs through every chapter is summed up in one haunting refrain: in those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. This isn't just ancient history. This is a mirror reflecting our own times when moral relativism rules and people create their own standards of right and wrong. The parallels to modern society are striking and unsettling. The structure of Judges follows a repetitive cycle that becomes almost hypnotic in its predictability. First, the Israelites do evil in the sight of the Lord. Then God allows foreign oppressors to dominate them. The people cry out in desperation. God raises up a judge to deliver them. There's a period of peace. Then the cycle begins again, each time worse than before. But who were these judges? They weren't wearing robes and sitting behind benches. These were military leaders, charismatic warriors, and unlikely heroes chosen by God to rescue his people from their enemies. Some were noble and righteous, others were deeply flawed, and a few were downright questionable in their methods and morals. Let's start with Othniel, the first judge and nephew of Caleb. His story is brief but sets the pattern. When the Israelites served foreign gods, God allowed the king of Mesopotamia to oppress him for 8 years. When they cried out, God raised up Othniel, who delivered them and judged Israel for 40 years of peace. Then comes Ehud, a left-handed Benjamite who pulled off one of history's most audacious assassinations. The Moabite king Eglon was so obese that when Ehud plunged an 18-inch dagger into his belly, the fat closed over the blade and the handle disappeared. Ehud escaped while the servants thought the king was using the bathroom. This isn't sanitized storytelling. This is gritty reality with divine purpose. Shamgar gets barely a mention, but his story is wild. He killed 600 Philistines with an ox goad, a farming tool. One man, one stick, 600 enemies. The brevity of his account only adds to its impact. But then we encounter Deborah, the only female judge, and her story breaks the mold entirely. She wasn't just a military leader but a prophetess who held court under a palm tree. When the Canaanite general Sisera oppressed Israel with 900 iron chariots, Deborah called upon Barak to lead the army. But Barak refused to go without her, showing either wisdom in recognizing her divine connection or a lack of faith in God's promise. The battle against Sisera becomes one of the most dramatic victories in the book. God sent a supernatural storm that turned the chariots into muddy traps, and Sisera fled on foot. He sought refuge in the tent of Jael, who welcomed him, gave him milk when he asked for water, and then drove a tent peg through his skull while he slept. The Song of Deborah in chapter 5 celebrates this victory with some of the most beautiful and violent poetry in Scripture. Gideon's story reveals how God delights in using the weak to shame the strong. When God called him to deliver Israel from Midianite oppression, Gideon was hiding in a winepress, threshing wheat in secret. He questioned God's call, asked for signs, and showed the kind of doubt and fear that many of us can relate to. God's response was to make Gideon's army smaller, not larger. From 32,000 volunteers, God whittled the force down to just 300 men. The selection process involved watching how the soldiers drank water. Those who lapped like dogs were chosen over those who knelt to drink. This seemingly arbitrary test revealed something about alertness and readiness for battle. The victory over the Midianites was entirely supernatural. Armed only with trumpets, clay jars, and torches, Gideon's men surrounded the enemy camp at night. At his signal, they broke the jars, blew the trumpets, and shouted. The confused Midianites began killing each other in the darkness, and those who survived fled in panic. But Gideon's story doesn't end in triumph. After his victory, he created a golden ephod that became an idol, leading Israel into spiritual adultery. The deliverer became a stumbling block, showing how even God's chosen leaders can fall into corruption. Abimelech, Gideon's son, represents the ultimate corruption of leadership. He murdered 70 of his half-brothers to secure power, ruling through fear and violence. His reign ended when a woman dropped a millstone on his head from a tower. Rather than be killed by a woman, he ordered his armor-bearer to finish him with a sword. Jephthah's account is perhaps the most tragic in the book. Born illegitimate and rejected by his family, he became a mighty warrior leading a band of outcasts. When the Ammonites threatened Israel, the elders who had once rejected him came begging for his help. Jephthah made a vow that would haunt him forever. He promised God that if victorious, he would sacrifice whatever came out of his house first to greet him. After his triumph, his only daughter ran out to celebrate his return. The text suggests he actually followed through with human sacrifice, though some scholars debate this interpretation. The final judge mentioned by name is Samson, whose story reads like ancient mythology mixed with tragedy. Born to barren parents through divine intervention, he was set apart as a Nazirite from birth. His supernatural strength came with conditions. He couldn't cut his hair, touch dead bodies, or drink alcohol. Samson's weakness for Philistine women led to his downfall. First with his wife from Timnah, then with a prostitute in Gaza, and finally with Delilah. Each relationship revealed more about his character flaws. He was impulsive, prideful, and driven by physical desires rather than spiritual commitment. When Delilah finally discovered the secret of his strength, she cut his hair while he slept. The Philistines captured him, gouged out his eyes, and made him grind grain like an animal. But hair grows, and in his final act, Samson brought down the temple of Dagon, killing more Philistines in his death than during his entire life. The book concludes with two appendix stories that show just how far Israel had fallen. The first involves a Levite who created his own priesthood and eventually led an entire tribe into idolatry. The second tells of a civil war that nearly wiped out the tribe of Benjamin over a horrific crime involving gang rape and murder. These stories aren't included for shock value. They demonstrate what happens when people abandon God's standards and create their own morality. The spiral into chaos becomes inevitable when there's no absolute authority to provide order and justice. The Book of Judges serves as both warning and hope. It warns us about the consequences of moral relativism and spiritual compromise. But it also shows God's incredible patience and willingness to rescue his people even when they repeatedly turn away from him. The judges themselves were flawed human beings, but God used them anyway. This gives hope to anyone who feels inadequate or disqualified from serving God's purposes. The book reveals that God's grace can work through broken people in broken situations to accomplish his perfect will. Understanding Judges helps us make sense of leadership, society, and human nature itself, showing that some truths never change, no matter how much time passes.